Harlem, New York, April 15th, 1968. The streets were quiet in a way that felt unnatural. Bumpy Johnson had just been buried. No speeches, no crown passed, just silence. And then, a single sound. Not a scream, not sirens. A sharp, unmistakable crack that echoed off the brownstones of Harlem. That sound didn't just end a man's life. According to street legend, it ended an era. But here's the truth most videos get wrong. Frank Lucas didn't inherit Harlem. He took it, piece by piece, after the rules were already broken. And before we even get to the trigger, we need to rewind, because the streets were already burning.
Before Frank Lucas ever pulled a trigger, Bumpy Johnson was already gone, and that matters. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson died of heart failure on April 7, 1968, inside Wells Restaurant on 126th Street. No bullets, no ambush, just the quiet ending of a Harlem institution. Bumpy ruled Harlem differently. He negotiated with the Italian Mafia, enforced discipline with reputation, and kept order with something Frank Lucas never valued: restraint. The streets ran on handshakes, debts, and memory. Violence was a tool, not a message. When Bumpy died, Harlem didn't crown a successor. It fractured. Multiple power centers emerged at once: Frank Lucas, Nicky Barnes, Joe the Boss Gallo's Italian interests, and Detroit-backed operators like Ike Atkinson still influencing the heroin pipeline. This wasn't a throne waiting to be filled. It was a street fight with no referee. Contrary to popular myth, Frank Lucas was not Bumpy's driver, nor his protege in any formal sense, a point confirmed by Mayme Johnson herself. Frank was close to Bumpy's circle, yes, but proximity is not inheritance. And in that chaos, one thing became clear. Harlem was no longer protected by a code. It was exposed.
Frank Lucas didn't rise because he was respected. He rose because he was efficient. By 1969, Lucas had leveraged direct heroin supply routes from Southeast Asia, working through military transport corruption later exposed in federal investigations. This became the foundation of what the streets would brand blue magic. But the numbers often get exaggerated. Not $1 million a day, at least not at first. What Lucas truly achieved was consistency, higher purity, lower price, ruthless enforcement. Unlike Bumpy, Frank didn't mediate disputes. He eliminated them. Harlem noticed the shift immediately. Violence became public. Disrespect was answered instantly. And unlike the Mafia, who preferred distance, Frank made sure people saw consequences. This wasn't accidental. It was strategic. Fear travels faster than reputation. And while Italian families like the Gambinos were watching closely, they didn't move against Frank immediately. As long as he stayed out of their rackets and paid when required, he was tolerated, for now. But on the streets, tolerance didn't exist. Only memory. And one man remembered Frank differently.
Bumpy Johnson's funeral was not chaos. It was controlled, solemn, watched, and heavy with unresolved tension. This is where many videos lose credibility. There were no cassette tapes playing in 1968 Harlem. Vinyl records ruled. Sylvia's, often mislocated in stories, had already been on Lenox Avenue since 1962, but it was not the site of the lair confrontation. What did happen was quieter and more dangerous. Witnesses and later accounts describe a moment of public disrespect, words exchanged, posture challenged, a refusal to acknowledge hierarchy. In Harlem's underworld, that mattered more than insults. One man, known on the street as Tango, laughed it off. According to multiple accounts, he believed Frank wouldn't act with so many eyes watching. That assumption would prove fatal, but not yet. Because Frank Lucas didn't pull the trigger at the funeral. He waited. And when the streets finally heard that sound on 116th Street days later, it wasn't rage that fired the gun. It was calculation.
East 116th Street wasn't random. It sat just outside the glare of Midtown and just inside Harlem's psychological borders, a place where business was handled, not discussed. By mid-April 1968, word had spread fast. Tango had dismissed the funeral tension as theater. He believed Frank Lucas was still playing by Bumpy Johnson's old rules. Respect the crowd, respect the witnesses, keep violence discreet. That assumption reflected how Harlem used to work. But Frank Lucas wasn't trying to preserve order, he was testing it. According to later street accounts, Tango had continued operating openly, refusing to acknowledge Frank's growing control over supply and territory. That wasn't just defiance, it was a signal to others watching. Harlem's underworld was crowded at the time. Nicky Barnes was rising fast. Other crews were aligned with Italian interests. Detroit-backed money was still circulating. Any sign of hesitation from Frank would be interpreted as weakness. So Frank didn't act immediately. He let the rumor travel. He let expectations harden. By the time Frank walked on to 116th Street, the decision had already been made, not in anger, but in policy.
The confrontation didn't look cinematic. No shouting, no dramatic buildup, just proximity. Multiple later accounts agree on one thing: the encounter was brief. Tango reportedly laughed, still assuming Frank wouldn't risk acting in daylight. That belief came from years of Harlem etiquette, where violence waited for darkness or privacy. But etiquette had already died. Frank Lucas stepped close, closer than most men would allow. A .45 caliber pistol doesn't require chaos. It requires confidence. There was one shot. Not because more were needed, but because one was enough. No prolonged struggle followed, no shootout. Tango's associates didn't rush Frank, not out of fear alone, but shock. Street violence relies on predictability. Frank had just shattered it. And then he did something that turned the act into legend. He walked away. That walk mattered more than the gunshot. It told Harlem that the rules had changed permanently and that witnesses were no longer protection.
The question viewers always ask is the right one. Why didn't Tango's crew retaliate immediately? The answer isn't cowardice, it's calculation. Retaliation requires unity, leadership, and certainty. Tango's death removed all three in seconds. His associates weren't an army, they were operators, suddenly exposed and unsure who else Frank Lucas had already aligned with. More importantly, Frank had already paid his dues quietly, not to Harlem, but to Italian power brokers. While the Mafia didn't sanction street-level chaos, they understood leverage. Frank wasn't attacking them, he was consolidating black-controlled territory. Carlo Gambino's organization took notice, not with outrage, but interest. Frank had proven something the Italians respected: control through fear, enforced personally. That didn't make Frank untouchable, it made him temporarily useful. And in organized crime, usefulness buys time. Time was all Frank needed.
The real impact of the shooting wasn't immediate violence. It was silence. Phones stopped ringing. Corners cleared early. Independent dealers quietly switched suppliers. Harlem understood what had happened, not because of rumor, but because of absence. Bumpy Johnson had acted as a buffer between Harlem and total collapse. Frank Lucas removed the buffer entirely. Where Bumpy balanced relationships, Frank enforced dominance. Where Bumpy negotiated with Italians, Frank studied them. Where Bumpy protected Harlem's image, Frank focused only on scale.
This is where blue magic truly accelerated. Not overnight, not magically, but steadily, methodically. Higher purity created dependency. Lower prices destroyed competitors. Violence eliminated hesitation. The shot on 116th Street didn't crown Frank Lucas king. It announced something colder. Harlem was now a marketplace, and mercy was no longer part of the business model.
Blue magic wasn't a brand at first. It was a consistency problem solved. Frank Lucas didn't invent heroin trafficking, but he streamlined it. By late 1969, Lucas had leveraged connections tied to U.S. military logistics returning from Southeast Asia. Investigations later confirmed that heroin was concealed within legitimate cargo flows, exploiting oversight gaps during the Vietnam War era. What made blue magic dangerous wasn't just purity, it was reliability. Harlem dealers knew exactly what they were getting every time. That eliminated bargaining, testing, and trust issues that plagued competitors. The money didn't arrive in a flood, it accumulated in layers. Independent dealers folded first, then mid-level distributors. Finally, entire blocks became dependent on Frank's supply chain. Prices undercut rivals, while margins stayed strong due to direct sourcing. This wasn't chaos, it was logistics. And logistics don't care about reputation, only throughput. By the time law enforcement began hearing the name Blue Magic, Harlem was already locked into the system.
One reason Harlem felt unstable in the early 1970s was simple. There wasn't one king. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson had unified Harlem's criminal economy. After his death, power split, and Nicky Barnes rose just as fast as Frank Lucas. Barnes operated differently. Where Frank centralized supply, Barnes dominated distribution. He controlled crews, corners, and enforcement through charisma and delegation. Barnes was visible, stylish, public. Frank was neither. This created confusion, later exaggerated by documentaries. How could two kings exist at once? Because they weren't fighting over the same thing. Frank controlled product. Barnes controlled territory. For a time, this uneasy balance held. But overlapping ambitions never stay separated forever. As blue magic expanded, Barnes' crews felt the pressure. Prices dropped, loyalty shifted, and Harlem's underworld braced for a collision that, interestingly, never fully happened, because something else intervened.
Contrary to myth, the Italian Mafia didn't rush to crush Frank Lucas. They evaluated him. Carlo Gambino's organization had long preferred insulation, distance between leadership and street violence. Frank's willingness to act personally was alarming, but also effective. He wasn't challenging Italian rackets. He was stabilizing black-controlled territory without asking for protection. That mattered. As long as Frank paid required percentages and avoided Italian neighborhoods, he was tolerated. Not embraced, but allowed to operate. This tolerance had limits. The Mafia watched two things closely: visibility and instability. Frank failed at one of them. By the early 1970s, his lifestyle became louder. Custom cars, tailored coats, public presence. The same confidence that secured his rise began to erode his insulation. And law enforcement was watching too. Quietly, patiently.
No empire collapses at its peak. It weakens beneath it. Frank Lucas's greatest strength, centralized control, became his vulnerability. Too much depended on too few people. Supply routes, storage locations, financial handling, all traceable with time. Federal agencies began coordinating quietly. Local police followed money patterns. Surveillance replaced raids. The goal wasn't interruption, it was exposure. Meanwhile, Harlem felt the cost. Addiction deepened. Violence became normalized. The community Bumpy Johnson once shielded now carried the weight of unchecked supply. Frank noticed the pressure, but misread it. He believed fear still protected him. That belief would prove costly, because the same streets that went silent after 116th Street were now whispering again. And whispers travel faster than gunshots.
Frank Lucas never lost control of Harlem. He lost control of attention. By the early 1970s, his presence no longer blended into the background. Custom luxury cars appeared where modest ones once parked. Tailored coats, wide-brim hats, and public confidence replaced anonymity. The very things that symbolized success also created contrast, and contrast attracts eyes. Law enforcement didn't need informants yet. They needed patterns. Large cash movements, repeated appearances at specific locations, associates living beyond plausible means. Federal agencies began mapping relationships rather than chasing rumors. This shift mattered. Street enforcement had failed for years because it focused on disruption. Federal investigations focused on documentation. Meanwhile, Harlem noticed something else. Protection was gone. Disputes escalated faster. Violence became more impulsive. Frank's model worked for profit, but it offered no stability for the street. The respect Bumpy Johnson once commanded had acted as restraint. Frank's fear-based authority had no brakes. And when fear becomes routine, people start planning exits.
Empires don't collapse from enemies first. They crack from the inside. Frank Lucas's organization depended on loyalty enforced by fear, not shared interest. That works until pressure rises. As surveillance increased and arrests mounted around the edges, associates began calculating risk versus reward. Some talked, others made mistakes. Cash storage sites were compromised, routines became predictable, and law enforcement began correlating small arrests into a larger structure. What made Frank vulnerable wasn't greed, it was confidence. He believed his system was too efficient to fail. But efficiency leaves fewer places to hide. Meanwhile, rivals like Nicky Barnes faced their own legal pressure. Competition turned inward as survival replaced expansion. The streets that once feared Frank now saw opportunity. Fear without protection invites betrayal. And federal agents were listening carefully.
The turning point didn't come with a shootout. It came with a door. In January 1975, federal agents raided Frank Lucas's New Jersey home. What they found wasn't symbolic, it was structural. Large sums of cash, firearms, documentation, evidence that linked lifestyle to income far beyond legal explanation. For the first time, the image cracked. Frank was arrested and released on bail, but the message was clear. The government wasn't guessing anymore. They were building. This raid altered how allies viewed him. Power looks different once it's searchable. Associates began distancing themselves. Supply chains tightened. Confidence wavered. Harlem felt the shift. Blue Magic's consistency faltered. Prices fluctuated. Uncertainty crept back into corners that had once felt locked in. The storm wasn't loud. It was organized.
Frank Lucas had always believed in one truth: act decisively, and hesitation disappears. But time doesn't hesitate. Every day after the raid weakened his position, not through violence, but through isolation. Contacts vanished. Associates avoided meetings. The system that thrived on precision now suffered from delay. Fear can silence people. It can't stop clocks. Federal prosecutors continued assembling the case piece by piece. No rush, no spectacle, just inevitability. The same streets that once froze after 116th Street were moving on. Harlem adapted, as it always had. The storm Frank brought had passed, but left damage behind. And as the walls closed in,
Frank faced a choice he'd never considered before: fight the system or negotiate with it. The trigger that once changed everything had no power here. Frank Lucas had built his empire on one belief: never explain, never cooperate, never bend. But the case against him wasn't built on rumors anymore. It was built on ledgers, surveillance, testimony, and seized cash. The federal government didn't need Frank to fall publicly. They needed him to connect dots. Facing a potential life sentence, Frank did something Harlem never forgave. He talked. Lucas agreed to cooperate with federal authorities, providing information that reached beyond Harlem into corrupt law enforcement, trafficking routes, and overlapping criminal networks. His cooperation wasn't emotional, it was transactional. For the government, Frank became valuable. For the streets, he became radioactive. This decision shattered the final illusion surrounding him. Fear no longer protected him. Silence no longer followed him. His name stopped meaning power and started meaning liability. The man who once walked away from a daylight killing was now walking into witness rooms.
Harlem didn't riot when Frank Lucas cooperated. It withdrew. Former allies refused contact. Old connections disappeared. The streets didn't seek revenge. They erased him. In the underworld, betrayal doesn't always end in violence. Sometimes it ends in absence. For many, Frank's cooperation confirmed what they already felt. His rule had never been about Harlem. It had been about scale. Addiction remained. Damage lingered. The community that Bumpy Johnson once buffered was left to rebuild without either man. Meanwhile, other figures, like Nicky Barnes, would later make similar decisions, reinforcing a brutal truth. When pressure becomes total, loyalty collapses. The era of Harlem Kings was ending. Not with gunfire, but with paperwork. The Italian Mafia didn't mourn Frank Lucas. They adjusted. From their perspective, Frank's cooperation confirmed long-held suspicions. Visibility creates vulnerability, and fear without insulation collapses under federal pressure. Carlo Gambino's organization and other families quietly distanced themselves from anyone connected to Lucas. No retaliation was needed. Frank had neutralized himself. For organized crime, the lesson was reinforced, not rewritten. Keep leadership insulated. Keep violence indirect. Never make yourself the symbol. Frank had broken every one of those principles. By the late 1970s, the Mafia's interest in Harlem shifted away from personalities and back toward controlled, lower-profile revenue streams. Frank Lucas wasn't remembered as a rival. He was remembered as a case study. That gunshot on 116th Street had once felt like a declaration, a line crossed, a city warned. But history has a way of reinterpreting noise. The sound that truly changed everything wasn't the trigger pull. It was the quiet closing of cell doors years later. The paperwork, the testimony, the unraveling. Frank Lucas didn't just end a life that day. He ended the possibility of ruling Harlem without consequence. Bumpy Johnson's era ended with dignity. Frank Lucas's ended with disclosure. The streets remember both, but very differently. One ruled with a code. The other ruled with fear. And in the end, neither outran time. Frank Lucas would eventually return to the streets, but not as a king. After serving time and entering witness protection, he came back to Harlem older, quieter, and stripped of the network that once defined him. The neighborhood had changed. So had the game. New generations didn't fear his name. They studied it as history. Attempts to re-enter criminal life were short-lived and unsuccessful. The systems Frank once mastered had evolved. and law enforcement scrutiny never fully disappeared. Power, once surrendered, is rarely reclaimed. Frank lived long enough to see his story retold, sometimes inaccurately, often exaggerated. Movies, interviews, and myths blurred fact with fiction, but the streets didn't revise their memory. To Harlem, Frank Lucas wasn't a legend. He was a moment, a sharp rise, a faster fall.
The true cost of Frank Lucas's reign wasn't measured in money or notoriety. It was measured in addiction rates, fractured families, and a community forced to absorb the aftermath of unchecked supply. Blue magic didn't disappear when Frank fell. Its impact lingered long after the headlines moved on. Bumpy Johnson had tried, imperfectly, to limit damage. Frank Lucas never attempted to. His model extracted value without reinvestment, leaving Harlem to rebuild alone. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, the federal government shifted focus from individual kingpins to systemic enforcement, but the damage was already done. Harlem survived because it always does, but it carried scars. This is the part crime stories rarely center, the neighborhood left behind when power collapses.
That sound on 116th Street has been replayed in stories for decades. A single gunshot, a moment of dominance, an era supposedly rewritten. But history doesn't hinge on noise. It hinges on consequence. The real sound that changed everything wasn't the trigger. It was the silence that followed years later. The silence of abandoned corners. The silence of cooperation rooms. The silence of a man who once believed fear could outrun time. Bumpy Johnson ruled Harlem with a handshake and restraint. Frank Lucas ruled it with force and inevitability. Both are remembered, but only one left space for balance. The street is the street, but history always collects its debts. And in the end, the loudest sound is never the gunshot. It's what remains after it fades.